Mr. Hardy, recognizing an interesting challenge, said enthusiastically, "Otis, my sons and I will start working on the case very soon." Frank and Joe were thrilled and asked if they might begin at once. Their father said he had an appointment and must leave. "Suppose Frank and I go out to the Moore estate," Joe proposed. "Maybe if we look around the house, we'll find a clue to the mysterious object." The lawyer said he would take them. He drove out of town along a road where there had once been large estates, which were now developments. He remarked that as soon as the Moore mystery was solved, the deceased man's property would be sold to a development company. That will add a nice sum for the beneficiaries. Presently, Mr. Weaver turned into a driveway lined with stately old pine trees and pulled up to a large Victorian house with grounds bordered by trim hedges. The lawyer parked the car and led the way up the high steps of the large porch. He unlocked the door, and the three entered. The interior was attractive, with highly polished mahogany furniture. Heavy red draperies hung the full length of the living room windows, which reached almost from ceiling to floor. A large desk stood at one end of the room, just beyond an enormous stone fireplace. "As you search for clues here," said Mr. Weaver, "you will find that this is typically a bachelor's home. Housekeepers whom Mr. Moore employed from time to time were not permitted to add any feminine touches to the furnishings." Frank and Joe made a quick tour of the first floor and decide where to start their search for the Aztec Warrior object. There were many objects standing on pedestals and on tables: gladiators, cowboys, and figures of athletes in action. "Well, what do you think, boys?" asked Mr. Weaver, who had waited for them in the main hall. "I suppose you'll start tapping walls and—" At that instant, there was a terrific crash upstairs. "What was that?" Frank asked. "I have no idea," Mr. Weaver replied. He and the boys dashed up the stairway, 2 steps at a time. Quickly, they separated and looked at the various bedrooms. There was no sign of anything having fallen. Mr. Weaver opened the door leading to the attic stairway and started up, with the boys crowding close on his heels. As they reached the attic, the three gasped. Amid a conglomerate of boxes and old furniture was a large mahogany bureau. It had fallen face forward. Pinned underneath it was a man. He was struggling to free himself. "Wow," Joe exclaimed as he and Frank and Mr. Weaver dashed forward. In a few moments, they had raised the bureau to a standing position, then turned their attention to the thin, middle-aged man who had been caught under it. He had ceased to struggle and now lay on the floor unconscious. He had a nasty gash on his head, was extremely pale, and his pulse rate was very low. "We'd better call an ambulance and have him taken to the hospital," Mr. Weaver spoke up. "I can't understand what he was doing here." "Do you know who he is?" Joe asked. "I think so," the lawyer replied. "We'll look for some identification to be sure." He opened the man's jacket and pulled a wallet from his pocket. "Yes, this is John Brower. He's one of the beneficiaries named in Mr. Moore's will." "One of the beneficiaries?" Frank exclaimed. "He must have been looking for something special." Mr. Weaver asked Joe to hurry downstairs and telephone for an ambulance. "We'd better not move Mr. Brower." While he and Frank were waiting, they kept close watch of the victim, but began to pull out the dresser drawers one by one to see what the man was after. "These certainly are stiff," Frank remarked. "Mr. Brower must have tried to open one and pulled the dresser over on himself." "I'm afraid so," Mr. Weaver agreed. "He had no right being here. I wonder how he got in." The drawers were filled with a collection of old books and old clothes. "Nothing unusual at all," Frank remarked. "I was hoping maybe we could find a clue to the Aztec Warrior object." Joe returned from the first floor and said the ambulance would be there in a few minutes. He went back downstairs to wait for it, and in a very short time an intern and an attendant carrying a stretcher came up to the attic. The doctor exclaimed. Mr. Brower then said, "This man must be taken to a hospital." The 2 men transferred the patient to the stretcher, carried him downstairs, and out to the ambulance with the boys following. As soon as it had driven away, Frank said he would like to return to the attic and make a search. Mr. Brower may have had a good hunch. Also, I noticed several boxes of picture slides. Maybe there'll be a clue to our case in one of them. Let's go, Joe urged. Chapter 2, An Attic Mishap. You mean there might be a picture of the Aztec warrior among these slides? Mr. Weaver asked. As he and the Hardys reached the attic. Yes, either of the man or of the object, Frank answered eagerly. Mr. Weaver was intrigued by the idea and suggested that the three of them carry the boxes of slides downstairs. When I was searching the house, I noticed a screen and a projector on the first floor. By the way, only a few of the boxes are marked, so you'll probably have hundreds of pictures to look at. Quickly, they gathered up the boxes and began lugging them down the 2 flights of main stairs. As Joe in the lead started for the first floor, he suddenly tripped on a worn spot on the carpeting. 2 boxes flew from his arms and he went sprawling. Joe started to slide downward, but caught a banister rail and pulled himself up, rubbing a bruised elbow. The slides lay in the hallway below, hopelessly mixed up. Great, he said in a chagrin. Frank chuckled. All in a sleuth's day. The boys picked up the slides, and Mr. Weaver brought out the screen and projector. While Joe set these up in the living room, Frank put aside the boxes on which there were notations of Greece, Italy, Egypt, and India. I'm sure we won't find a picture of either Aztec warrior among these, he said. I'll bet they were looking for has something to do with Mexico. The draperies were drawn, and Frank began handing slides from unmarked boxes to Joe. The first group of pictures looked as if they had been taken in the Rocky Mountains. Then came scenes in Hawaii, Canada, and England. Although the boys had not yet come across any pictures of Mexico, they were so fascinated by the slides that they did not realize a full hour had gone by. Presently, Mr. Weaver mentioned the time. 2 more boxes and we'll have to quit, he announced. I must get back to the office. Joe turned the projector to full speed, and the slides began flashing on and off the screen. Suddenly, Frank gave a shout. We've hit Mexico. That's a building in the University of Mexico City. You've been there? Mr. Weaver asked him. Joe and I visited Mexico and once had a fleeting glimpse of Mexico City. But I recognize the university from pictures I've seen. Joe then threw a slide on the screen, which Mr. Weaver recognized as the Pyramid of the Sun, one of the great ruins outside Mexico City. Hold that picture, Frank called out. It's Aztec. There might be a clue in it. The Hardys could not detect anything extraordinary. The few people in the picture were not distinct enough to be recognized. Joe released the hold button, and the projector began to work automatically again. There were some pictures of candle cactus and of a lake with fishermen who held strange-looking nets. That's Lake Patsakura, said Mr. Weaver. Those are the butterfly nets. It's the only place in the world where fish nets like those are used. Well, boys, I must leave. We'll come back sometime and look at the rest of the slides. Would you mind if Joe and I stay here and finish them now? Frank asked. Mr. Weaver smiled. Personally, no, but I have a responsibility as an executor, and such a thing might be criticized. Well, he was talking. Joe showed one more slide. It was a picture of 2 men standing side by side. Joe pushed the hold button. That one on the left is Mr. Moore, the lawyer said excitedly. And the Indian Spanish-looking gentleman with him, Joe said. Is it Roberto Hermoso? I don't know, Mr. Weaver replied. Frank was staring at the picture. He just might be the direct descendant of the Aztec warrior, he cried out. Mr. Weaver was so excited he forgot all about leaving. Joe quickly ran through the rest of the slides in the box. Each one showed the same 2 men in various parts of a lovely garden. Mr. Weaver, said Frank, since some of these slides are similar, would you let me take one and make a print from it? The lawyer considered the request, then finally consented. Frank picked out the clearest view of Mr. Moore and his companion, put the slide in a handkerchief, and slipped it in his pocket. The projector screen and boxes of slides were put away. Then the lawyer and the two young detectives left the house, locking the door. As soon as the boys reached home, they went to their workshop over the garage to make a print, which Frank later tucked into his wallet. As the brothers were walking to the house, their father drove in. Any luck? He asked. We think we had a little, Frank told him, pulling out the picture. One man is Mr. Moore. The other may be either Herberto Hermosa or the Aztec Warrior descendant. We found the picture in a box of Mr. Moore's Mexican slides. The three went into the comfortable, well-furnished house, where they were greeted by Mrs. Hardy. She was a small, slender woman with a sweet smile. She tried to take the adventuresome life of her family philosophically, but worried over the dangers she knew they encountered. They were met also by Miss Gertrude Hardy, the detective's sister, who lived with them. She was a tall, spare woman who adored her nephews, but frequently made it quite clear she thought they were not cautious enough in their sleuthing. Upon a few occasions, her dire predictions of danger had come true. Frank and Joe had been through many hair-raising adventures, starting with the mystery of the Tower treasure. Recently, they had solved the most unusual case, the Viking symbol mystery, in northwest Canada. When Aunt Gertrude heard about the beneficiary who had been searching in the attic, she said tartly, "That idea. Why, he should be cut out of the will. There's no telling what he's already gotten away with." "We don't know he was trying to steal anything," Frank defended Mr. Brower. Aunt Gertrude was unconvinced. "There may be secret hiding places in that house," she declared. "If I were in Mr. Weaver's place, I'd get out a search warrant and go through all that Mr. Brower's effects." Mr. Hardy patted his sister's shoulder. "I'm sure that the man will have a good explanation when he regains consciousness. Let's give him a chance to tell his story. This is your case, of course, but I wouldn't put too much faith in that man," she said, and she hurried to the kitchen. Mrs. Hardy waited with the boys while the detective telephoned the hospital. He reported to his family that Mr. Brower was still unconscious. "He must have had a bad whack on the head," Mr. Hardy remarked. Frank and Joe talked about the case until lunch was ready. The meal included one of Aunt Gertrude's famous strawberry shortcakes, topped with a sea of whipped cream. Presently, the conversation turned again to the mystery. "I think we should bone up on Mexican history," said Frank, "especially the period when the Aztecs were in power." They excused themselves from the table and went to their father's library. Each boy selected a volume on Mexico's fascinating history. "Phew, human sacrifice," Joe suddenly exclaimed. "They chose a young man and for 1 year gave him the best food and clothes and entertainment possible, then killed him as a sacrifice to the war god." "Yes, and everything was done in the name of religion, with the priests as the killers," Frank remarked. The boys studied pictures of the elaborate costumes worn by Aztec warriors. "Pretty fancy," Joe remarked. He pointed to a colorful illustration of a warrior in headdress and shirt of yellow parrot feathers and sprays of costly quetzal feathers, all decorated with gold. Another picture showed a whole squadron wearing uniforms made of jaguar skins and carrying shields adorned with golden discs, butterflies, and serpents. On their feet were embroidered sandals with thongs of orange leather. The Hardys looked up as they heard a car roar up in front of the house and stop. He grinned. "I'll bet that's Chet." Joe peered from the window. "You're right." Coming up the walk was a stout, good-natured looking boy, a schoolmate of the Hardys. Chet Morton was a particular friend, and often but unwittingly found himself involved in the mysteries the brothers were solving. "Hi, fellows," he said as Joe opened the door, and he walked in. "Why so glum?" he asked. "Something happened?"